Good morning, everyone. Today I have with me Dr. John J. Collins, who you guys probably know if you follow the channel. He is one of the foremost biblical scholars in the world, a former professor at Yale of the Hebrew Bible. I think he's also taught at Notre Dame. He is one of the foremost experts on the book of Daniel in the world. Um, his commentary on it, the Hermeneia Daniel commentary, is still the standard academic commentary on the Book of Daniel, and he just has so many works. It's kind of insane. I mean, he has uh, shorter commentaries on I think Malachi and Joel and Isaiah for the New Collegeville and the Old Collegeville commentary. I mean, he has a book on biblical values. I mean, he just has a lot of work. So one of the foremost biblical authorities, really. And I had him here today to discuss really the book of Daniel and Isaiah because those are my interests, as you know. So with that, let's begin the questioning. So, Dr. Collins, of course, you're infamous for the opinion that the one like a son of man in Daniel chapter 7 is not the kingdom, as many rabbis had come to accept, and was the academic consensus for a while, but instead it's an angel, likely Michael. Um, I, how would you respond to the objection that Daniel has already set it up so that you interpret the one like a lion to be a kingdom, the one like a bear to be a kingdom, the one like a leopard to be a kingdom? So when you get to the one like a son of man, shouldn't you also interpret him to be a reference to a kingdom or to the saints of the Most High?
Actually, I think Daniel is ambiguous on the other beast, that it refers to them both as kings and kingdoms. So, they represent kingdoms, and the one like a son of man represents he receives a kingdom. So he's not the kingdom himself,
Mhm.
but he received, and I think he's obviously related to the Jewish people in this context, but I think it's as representative because wherever you find in a vision in Daniel and in apocalyptic literature generally, uh, in a vision when you see a man or somebody like a man, it turns out to be an angel.
Mm. And
Gabriel is
yeah,
the other candidate in Daniel.
yeah. And do you think it could be that it is an angel that Daniel sees, but it's not literally talking about an angel coming, but it's an angel that represents a kingdom, just like the one like
Yeah,
the bear in that interpretation represents. So in this interpretation, he does see a vision, like the audience is supposed to understand, yeah, it's Michael or Gabriel, but it's not literally talking about him. It's just in the vision.
that's right. Yeah, it's in the
Yeah.
vision.
Mhm. Okay. And when it talks about the nation serving the one like a son of man, does he expect the nations to serve the one like a son of man in a way that they know who Michael is, they know who the one like a son of man is, or is it like they're serving the kingdom, and so what happens on earth represents what happens in heaven, and that's sort of what's going on.
I think it's more the latter. Now, of course,
Mm,
the problem is that Daniel just doesn't say very much about the kingdom and doesn't give you any clear idea as to what he expects to happen on earth. But he does seem to expect that, the Jewish people will come to power. Now, Michael is the heavenly level of this. You see, there is a nice passage later on in chapter 10 where the angel Gabriel explains to him that what's really happening is that Gabriel is in a wrestling match with the Prince of Greece, and the only one who is helping him is Michael, your prince. So behind every people, there is a heavenly figure. At earlier times, these would just be called gods. Daniel calls them princes. we tend to call them angels, but it's all pretty much the same thing. They're lesser gods, if you like. They're not the Most High, but they're not human.
Yeah, so God's, the way it's used in earlier biblical literature, would just mean a heavenly figure.
Right.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
clarify that for my audience because the way that we think about God is like Islamically, the term ilah means something that's worshipped. So
yeah,
it's not the same as in the Hebrew Bible where it means a heavenly figure. So in that sense, angels are heavenly figures. They're gods, but they're not gods in the sense that they're objects of worship. The
that's
Israelites didn't worship them.
that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Now, yeah.
they're even in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the
Mhm.
word Elohim or Elim is used for beings other than the Most High.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So, coming a bit to the composition of the book of Daniel. So, the standard position seems to be that chapters 2 to 6 are were an independent oral tradition, independent court tales that were then collected by a redactor, and he put them together. And um, that's chapter 7 was written after that, ne- near the Maccabean period, and then chapters 8 to 12 were written really when Antiochus, the persecution was happening, and then someone just collected all these together. And I seen Kip Davis actually show some evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls of the final vision circulating independently. So. Uh, is that accurate? And what about chapter 1? Do you still hold that chapter 1 was added later and then translated into Hebrew?
Well, it could have been written in Hebrew, but I think it was written as an introduction. Only, chapter 1 only really seems to be an introduction to the tales. And that's why I thought it might have been written in Aramaic. But, I don't really have linguistic arguments to show that it was translated. It's just that it seems to be an introduction specifically for the tales. And since the tales are in Aramaic, you'd expect that it would have been in Aramaic, but it could have been written in Hebrew. Now, I think chapter 7, must have been written already in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, because, the whole depiction of the fourth beast presupposes the attack on the cult, which is what really bothered Daniel.
Yeah, and so for those who don't know, Antiochus, basically chapters 8 through 12 especially are talking about Antiochus. This is a figure in the Greek period. He came, almost destroyed the temple. He defiled the temple, and there was this great persecution of the Israelites. And so Daniel chapters 8 through 12 seem to be written as a response to that. And in chapter 7, we might have a reference to Antiochus as well when it mentions um, the little horn.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a number of scholars believe that that's a later addition, and then
Yeah,
someone updated. What do you think about that?
I've never been persuaded of that.
Hmm.
But, there are serious scholars who think so. And I think Carol Newsom now wrote the best commentary after mine. I mean, later than mine. I think she takes that position, which surprised me a little bit. Now, it's possible, but you see, the difficulty with it, and that there's a whole school of German scholarship that wanted to isolate an earlier vision within Daniel 7. And this would presumably have been maybe in reaction to Alexander. But the trouble is, you see, we don't have any other evidence of a problem back then or of a Jewish movement. Sorry, I need to. A little extraneous interruption there. Sorry. um, the, you have to kind of invent an incident. in the early Hellenistic period to get a situation than when it might have been written. And so that's why I think it's in.
You can answer if you want.
No, I don't want to answer it, actually. It's a spam call.
Yeah, I get a lot of those spam calls.
Yeah.
And now they're doing like these tricks with AI where they like not talk and they want you to talk so that they get your AI voice and then they like use it to like call your family and stuff. So it's
Yeah.
just really annoying.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Mhm.
yeah, so now Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 7, they follow a four kingdom schema. So we
Yes.
have sort of the four this sort of understanding of history where we have four major world empires and we have sort of the eras of the world. And so we get this in Near Eastern texts with like Assyria, and then Mede, and then Persia, and then Greece. And Daniel chapter 2 and 7 also clearly follow a four kingdom schema, and after that comes God's kingdom. Now, Daniel chapter 8, to me, doesn't seem to be following a four kingdom schema. That's why the Jewish study Bible says that it's abandoned the four kingdom schema. We sort of just go to a ram, which is one
Yeah.
animal, a ram with two horns, and then we get like a goat. And then if you look at the end of like Daniel chapter 11, 12, then it's the resurrection. So it seems to me like one kingdom is missing there. Some people, I know they tried to argue that the, the ram has two horns and one comes up before the other. So it's like one kingdom, then the second. But that imagery, uh, the imagery of the beast really seems to be one kingdom and the horns seem more to be the rulers. So would you say that Daniel chapter 8 has abandoned the four kingdom schema?
Uh, not necessarily abandoned. I mean, if you ask the author of Daniel 8, are there four kingdoms? Will there be four kingdoms? Or have there been four kingdoms? He would probably have said, yeah. But that's not the what he chooses to work with. So it's not as if he said there will not be four kingdoms, or that he said there will only be two kingdoms. It's just that he kind of cuts to the chase, to the end of that, to the
Hmm.
transition to the last two. So it's a different focus, but this is the idea in Daniel 7 to 12. You have a sequence of visions, and they're all going over the same ground essentially, but doing it in different ways. And so that's what Daniel 8 is doing with Daniel 7. It's picking out some of the motifs and working with them, but
Yeah.
varying it.
So I push back a bit on that. So the common critical position is that Mede is one empire and then Persia is a second empire, but the author of Daniel 8 has them both as one animal. So it seems to me that he's collapsed. So he's sort of like I
Oh,
would assume
okay.
that after
Yeah.
Alexander he expects the kingdom of God. So it would seem he's changed from four to three kingdoms.
Well, he doesn't deny that there was a Babylonian kingdom.
Yeah, so then you'd have
He just doesn't
Babylon.
talk about it. He just starts later in the sequence.
Mhm. Yeah.
Now, I think you have a good point. He doesn't seem to be distinguishing Media and Persia. And that's interesting because you find that later on. So when you get down to Josephus in the first century, Media and Persia are treated as one. And the later tradition then will make the fourth kingdom Rome rather than Greece. And that's how they do it, is by treating Media and Persia as one. So you could say Daniel 8 has gone a step in that direction.
Yeah, so for those who don't know, basically traditional scholars, the way they interpret the kingdoms are Babylon and then Medo-Persia together, and then Greece, then Rome. Whereas critical scholars, they often hold that Media and Persia are two different kingdoms. So you get Babylon, then Media, then Persia, then Greece. So there's no Rome in what often a lot of critical scholars hold. Now, traditional scholar. Now, I do think the evidence in Daniel is actually divided, which is why traditional
Uh-huh.
scholars do have, and even you can see some critical scholars um, agreeing that yeah, there is some evidence in the Medo-Persia sort of domain. Like I seen Driver sort of comments on this, and even you in your commentary in Daniel 6 when it speaks about the law of the Medes and Persians, the law of the Medes and Persians, you quote Jerome saying it would be like this combination of Media Persia would be anachronistic if a Median kingdom preceded the Persian. Jerome observes it's perfectly evident that there was only one kingdom of the Medes and Persians, both under the rule of Darius and Cyrus. So I think um,
Mm.
it's not as clear as critical scholars say that it's Media and Persia. I think different authors have different opinions, and obviously the author of
Yeah.
Daniel uh, 10 through 12, you know, he has the little horn as Antiochus and Greece as the final kingdom, and he expects the resurrection after that. So that's his understanding, absolutely. But then is that the same understanding as the redactor of Daniel A? And is that the same understanding as Daniel 2 is an independent oral tradition? So was that the understanding of Daniel 2? I'm not so sure about that because when you just read Daniel A, for example, you do get like in Daniel 5, the kingdom is divided and given to both the Medes and Persians. In Daniel 6, you have both the law of the Medes and the Persians, and then Daniel 8, you have a ram, one ram representing both. So I think the evidence is more divided and it's more complicated than one or the other.
Okay, let me say one or two things. Now, you, as I'm sure you know, you also find this sequence of kingdoms in several pagan sources.
Yeah.
And also in another Jewish source in the Fourth Sibylline Oracle, where
Mhm.
Assyria is the first kingdom. And the early ones of those, like second century BC or thereabouts, and some later ones, list Media as the second. So there was a tradition. Now, I think in Daniel wants to accept that, and it's for that reason that Darius is called a Mede, which is one of the notorious historical mistakes in the book of Daniel. And I think that's the only reason for making him a Mede, is so that, because then you get in a Babylonian king, a Median king, a Persian king, and you end up expecting the Prince of Greece to come. So I think Daniel accepts that. Now, what's quite possibly, but you may then get some variations on it too, because I think by the time Daniel was written, they probably thought of the Medes and Persians as really one. And you're quite right that in Daniel 8, I think the beast with the two horns, the Medes and the Persians, well, that's two sides of the same kingdom, you might say. So, they can play with it and use it one way when it suits them and use it the other way when it suits them. But I think the fact that they make Darius a Mede shows that they're using that traditional sequence of four,
Yeah.
the traditional sequence of that separates the Medes and the Persians, which you also get already in Herodotus, or back then. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, with Darius the Mede. So this is a figure for those who don't know that appears in the book of Daniel, and he's the king before Cyrus. So after Babylon comes
Yeah.
Darius the Mede, then comes Cyrus the Persia. The problem is there's no historical source even in the Bible that talks about Darius the Mede apart from the book of Daniel. So most scholars will say that Daniel just made this figure up. Um, and that does seem to be the case. Um,
Whereas,
so
of course, there
does
was a Persian king
yeah,
Darius.
yeah, yeah. Now, do you think that the author is essentially he's unaware that Cyrus saved the Jews from Babylon, because that just seems very strange. Like he doesn't know that Cyrus is the one who came and defeated Babylon.
Well, it has been said, you know who Geza Vermesh was? He was a great
Yeah.
professor at Oxford. And he made the point that it seemed that people in the 2nd century BC in Judea knew very little about Persian history.
Yeah.
It was all pretty hazy to them. Now, did Daniel know? I mean, it'd be amazing if Daniel didn't know about Cyrus. But you see, the thing is, Daniel doesn't want to acknowledge the restoration as being somehow
Mhm.
definitive. And there are several texts like that in the 2nd and 1st century BC that want to say we're still waiting for that deliverance. We're still in exile.
Mhm. You get that in Daniel 9, of course,
Yeah,
where
yeah.
70 years is now 490 years.
So, whatever happened under Cyrus doesn't really count.
Yeah.
Didn't get the job done.
Yeah. Um, I wonder, perhaps he wants to get media in there because you get these texts in Isaiah and Jeremiah that Babylon's going to be destroyed by the Medes. So if it's destroyed by Cyrus, well, what do we do with these texts which say it's going to be destroyed by the Medes? So maybe the
Yeah,
author thought, let me just put in.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, Okay. And yeah, so another thing I find interesting, the Book of Esther also often uses the combination Persia and Mede, like in chapter 1, verse 3, the army of Persia and Media, chapter 10, verse 2, are they not written in the annals of the kings of Media and Persia? So it seems to me perhaps in the Hellenistic period, Jews thought of them as the same kingdom, but obviously that's anachronistic. They were never two kingdoms.
Yeah,
They were never one kingdom.
yeah,
This is anachronistic, but it seems to me perhaps Jews in the Hellenistic period did sort of think of them as one kingdom, perhaps.
yeah. I mean, certainly at some point they came to think of them as one kingdom.
Hmm. Yeah, and that's anachronistic, by the way.
And that, yeah,
Again, for those.
yeah.
Now coming to some post, well, probably can't call this post biblical, but maybe post Daniel interpretation, post biblical, because then we're going to talk about some of the New Testament stuff, which obviously assumes Rome as the fourth kingdom. Um, so you get this idea that Jesus is the one like the Son of Man. Now, it's interesting in the New Testament, he's not called one like a Son of Man. He's just called Son of Man. Do you
Yeah.
think there's anything significant going on there?
Well, you see, in the New Testament, they're really identifying the figure in Daniel as Jesus. And so he becomes quite definite, the Son of Man.
Yeah.
But,
Now, um, scholars have often noted that in Daniel 1, in the book of Daniel, let's just put it that way, there's not any Davidic messianic
right.
language. Shoot of David's going to come, a branch of David's going to come. But obviously in the New Testament, Jesus is the Messiah and he's linked to the Son of Man. And then in texts like you have some apocryphal texts from that time period that explicitly identify this as a messianic kingdom. So that is a later development, you think? And
That's,
Daniel, did the author reject the messianic promise?
you see, well, I have a whole theory on this. In the case of when the book of Daniel was written, I think there wasn't any active expectation of a Messiah. Now, by a Messiah here, I mean a king from the Davidic line who would restore a native kingship in Judah. And even though Daniel talks about a kingship, they're not expecting a Davidic king, evidently.
Hmm.
And when they use the word Mashiach, they're referring to a high priest. And of course, the high priest had, in fact, been the ruler in Judea for most of the whole Second Temple period. Now, you get a revival of Messianic expectation then about 100 years after Daniel. And this happens because the Hasmoneans, the descendants of the Maccabees, made themselves kings. And some of the purists said they shouldn't do that. They're not descended from David. So, God, please send us a descendant of David to be our king. And that became all the more urgent then when the Romans took over, because then you needed somebody to kick out the Romans. So by the time Jesus comes along, I think you had quite an active expectation or hope, at least, for a Messiah, meaning a Davidic Messiah who would restore the kingdom.
Yeah. And in Josephus, we actually get these figures doing like Mosaic typology, a little bit of Joshua typology, and saying we're going to save you from the Romans. So it seems there was an expectation that the Messiah has to come save us from the Romans, or the prophet like Moses has to come and save us from the Romans. Now, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, these are different figures. In the Gospel of John, these are different figures. So it's perhaps a competition here.
Well, yeah, and then in the New Testament, they roll them all in together, more or less.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think, I don't think they ever expected the prophet like Moses to be somebody who'd save them from the Romans. I think that was the job. And now you'll find lots of people nowadays who will say that there was no definite idea of a Messiah, that it was just a title and you fill it any way you want. And this is nonsense, because there's a perfectly clear expectation of what a Davidic Messiah was supposed to be. He's first of all supposed to be a military leader who will drive out the foreigners.
Yeah.
And then when he has done that, then the priestly Messiah can kind of take over in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The prophet, I think, is somebody who is going to announce that these things are happening, but the prophet isn't really a savior figure.
What about, so in Josephus, the claimants who are claiming to be a prophet and doing like Mosaic typology, like we're going to split the sea, they often are like going in the desert and trying to lead their followers back. Yeah. So perhaps the prophet is supposed to bring them in the land. That's the idea.
Well, no, I think the prophet was just giving a sign of what was going to happen. But the prophet wasn't really doing it.
All right. So coming a bit more to the interpretation of these texts. Now, is it correct to say that whenever we're reading a biblical text, there's sort of three contexts that we can read it in? We can read it in the compositional context. So like we're reading a chapter in Daniel based on the entire book as we have it. And then we have the post-compositional context. That would be, or like the canonical context. So that would be like, we're going to take all the Bible as a whole, and we're going to interpret the book of Daniel in light of that. And then we have sort of a pre-compositional context, which is, for example, in this case, it would be, well, Daniel A, which is the first 6 chapters, is different from Daniel B. So we're just going to isolate Daniel A or isolate Daniel B. And then you can go even beyond that. You can be like, okay, Daniel A is made up of chapters 2 to 6. These were independent court legends that were then collected together. So we can just interpret each of them on their face value without needing to interpret them in light of each other. So is that correct? Is that how biblical scholars look at it?
Yeah. One of the uncomfortable facts that has kind of come to light over the last 50 years, especially, is that you can read a text almost any way you want to. You can read it as science fiction if you feel like it. Now, whether all of these readings have equal validity, that's a whole other question. And a lot depends, on what you expect to get from a text and what you're using the text for. But I think all of the ones you mentioned are perfectly reasonable ways of reading a text. It's good, to be aware of the different contexts.
And so the way this text was then interpreted throughout the century. So one of the interesting, and you speak about this on page 87 of your commentary, is that with the rise of Islam, you had Jews and Christians adjusting the interpretation once again. so
Yeah.
that now the fourth kingdom is either both Rome and Islam, or just Islam. Ibn Ezra has Rome is an offshoot of the Greek Empire. You speak a little bit about where that idea comes from, Islam being incorporated into all this.
Oh, I think that just comes, I don't know a whole lot about that, but certainly, by the time of the Reformation, or by the time like 1600 thereabouts, when Islam was perceived as a threat to Europe. Now, then that was the beast. Now, I think in the 20th century, I wouldn't have been surprised if Russia became the beast at some point. You
Yeah.
get, this is in the nature of the genre, that they don't name names most of the time, and that means you can reinterpret them.
So it's just reinterpreting the text based on so history doesn't turn out the way we expect. So instead of adjusting our expectations, we adjust our interpretation of the text.
Exactly. Exactly. This has probably happened more with the book of Revelation in the New Testament
Hmm.
than with any other book, because people read it as predicting things that are going to happen in our time. And so the enemy keeps changing. There's a famous book, The Late Great Planet Earth, by a Christian fundamentalist. And, he went through, in fact, it went through multiple editions, and he kept updating the enemy, the beast, because he wanted to fit whatever was going on at the moment.
Yeah, it's just enemies whoever we're at war against at the present time.
Yeah.
um on the other hand, you get this so on the one hand we have sort of Jews and Christians trying to make Islam the fourth beast in Daniel 7. On the other hand, we have some classical Islamic interpretations that are saying Islam is the kingdom of God, and so they're actually following the sort of traditional Jewish
Yeah.
Christian reckoning of with Rome, but right
Yeah.
after that, Islam comes as the kingdom of God. What do you think about that?
That's, that probably makes sense for Muslims, or it made sense for some Muslims at some time. You also had a claim at the time of the rise of the Puritans in the English Revolution. They thought they were the holy ones of the Most High, and that Daniel was about them.
Hmm.
So, you get this already in the Dead Sea Scrolls, actually, the idea that scripture is really about us. So take it completely out of the context in which it was written, and it's a very narcissistic way of interpreting anything.
Yeah. So, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we sort of have, or no, sorry, in Daniel chapter, the final vision, we sort of have Isaiah 53 being applied to Daniel's
Yeah,
disciples.
yeah.
Now that seems to be very much out of context for for Isaiah
Well,
53.
it is, but a lot depends. You see, Daniel doesn't actually say, and this is what Isaiah was talking about.
Hmm.
It's just saying that the pattern that you find in Isaiah 53 applies to these people. Now, that, I think, is a very natural way we use that, not only scripture that way, but we use Shakespeare that way. We can, you can take a famous character from a novel, Uriah Heep in Dickens. And if you see a character like that, you can say, "Oh, that's a Uriah Heep." So that's one of the ways we use literature, is it provides us with models, types, and I think that's what's going on in Daniel 11.
Hmm. Yeah.
Now, in the New Testament, you see, that's a bit different, because they actually want to claim that this is actually what I say.
Yeah. I mean, the New Testament, we obviously get this the most with Matthew. He To be honest, he sort of butchers a lot of texts, but I think, he's not actually butchering them. That's just a way of interpretation at that time. You get in the Dead Sea Scrolls as well. It's this highly typologized, sort of out of context fluff use of scripture. So infamously with Hosea 11, where Hosea says, "Out of Egypt I called my son," the Exodus now becomes Jesus coming out of Egypt as as a
Yeah.
child. Yeah. So yeah, to be honest, because of stuff like, I mean, I understand what he's doing in the first century Jewish context, but I don't really trust Matthew too much. So yeah, that's what I actually, I sometimes Matthew will frame a saying or a story in a certain way, and I would rather just take the story or the saying at face value, because I don't trust Matthew's framing of it. So, for example, we get the story in the Gospels that Jesus is talking to the scribes, and he's saying, "Why do they say the Messiah's got to be the son of David when David called him my master?" Now, it seems to me pretty obvious that in, like, the obvious way to read that story is Jesus denying that the Messiah is supposed to be the son of David, and maybe even saying this is the work of scribes, because in Mark he says, "Why did the scribes say this?" Which,
Mhm.
interestingly, a lot of Old Testament scholars will say, "Oh, scribes came in Amos 9, they added in the Messiah in Hosea." So I think maybe, at least it seems to me pretty clear that on the surface level he's denying that the Messiah is supposed to be the son of David. But obviously, the way Matthew frames it, Matthew has Jesus being the son of David right in the beginning. So there's no way you can read that story that way. So that, sometimes I bring this up and I get the response, "Oh, it's a riddle. It's a riddle and it's supposed to make you realize Jesus." To me, that's so far-fetched. And so I don't like to read stuff based on Matthew's framing of it. I would rather just look at the original context.
The interesting point about that, I think, is it shows you a little tension between what Jesus says in the Gospel of Matthew and what Matthew
Mm.
says.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
it makes you think, Jesus may not have been into this Davidic Messiah thing at all.
yeah, yeah.
But that's
Yeah.
another way. We're not going there.
And you get this in John as well.
Yeah.
So especially with the saying of, like, destroy this temple and in 3 days I'll raise it up. Now in John, that's the body of Jesus, but you also get it in Mark, and it seems obvious that the real meaning, if Jesus said that, or wherever it originated, was not about Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, but that's how the author of John wants you to take it. So we have to sometimes be careful when we're reading the biblical text that, some of these redactors, honestly, a little fishy at times, and don't always take their framing for it.
Well, they reinterpret things, let's
Hmm.
say.
Yeah. And
So that if you are of the opinion that the real meaning of a text is what the author meant by it,
mhm,
some of them are pretty remote from that.
yeah.
But of course, there are all sorts of people nowadays who wouldn't say that the meaning of a text is what the author meant by it.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah. And to be honest, with Matthew and John, sort of, like, I don't trust those two others. I would have to say a bit similar about the author of Daniel, the redactor, because here we have a person who is working with sources, right?
mhm,
Independent sources for the court legends, at least, or the court stories.
mhm.
Um, but he himself doesn't seem to be very knowledgeable about the Persian period or the Babylonian period, and
and wasn't interested in history,
yeah, and maybe
amazingly.
yeah, maybe is even doing this as a parody, as a joke. He just begins
Well,
with massive.
take Daniel chapter 4,
Yeah.
where he takes a story that we now have good evidence was really a story about Nabonidus rather than
Yeah.
Nebuchadnezzar. And, it goes through several layers of hyperbole. And,
Mhm.
and now that one, of course, may actually have been meant as a parody and as a bit of a joke.
Yeah. And what about so you get this story in Jewish texts about Abraham being saved from a fire. That
Yes.
seems quite similar to Daniel chapter 3. Do you think that's another version of the Daniel 3 story? Uh, and that's further evidence of like these were originally independent stories, or do you think that's just not related?
Well, the story of Abraham being saved from the fire, as far as I know, you only get that a bit later, maybe first century AD
Yeah.
or thereabouts. And so, by then it would have been difficult not to associate it with the story from Daniel. But the reason they attached it to Abraham was because of the story that he came from Ur of the
Mhm.
Chaldees. And it's a
I think
pun
there's
on
a
Ur.
yeah, I think there's a scholar who uh, hypothesizes that Genesis knew about the story, but like as a propaganda, did not put it in. I've heard this as well.
Yeah,
But
I think that's far-fetched, though.
now it's interesting. You get these sort of like in rabbinic literature, these elaborate stories based on like some little strange reading of a text or like a pun and this and that. And rabbinic scholars often seem to think that the midrash is secondary. And I personally, when I was just looking at Talmud, I had no idea about critical scholarship of
Mm.
anything. I would read this stuff. I'd be like, that's so far fetched. How do you get these elaborate stories from just like this one little midrash? And I thought, obviously, they have their own independent tradition, and they're just reading. They're finding an excuse to read it into the biblical text. And
Well, they are. Are you familiar with the work of James Kugel?
no, I'm not James Kugel.
Well, he has two huge books, The Traditions of the Bible and The Bible as It Was.
Hmm.
And the gist of his argument is that people, tried to fill in the gaps in the biblical text as they
Hmm.
received it. And this surely is true a lot of the time. And so, they then try to make connections. And you see, if you have a very limited corpus of literature to work with, you have to squeeze all sorts of meanings out of it and squeeze all sorts of meanings into it. And that's kind of what they do. So they
Hmm.
didn't always necessarily have independent traditions. So in the case, say, of Abraham being rescued from the fire, I think that tradition arose out of the biblical text. And it's because people looked at it and they said, Ur. Now that could be fire. So that's where that came from, I think.
I personally find all this midrash a bit suspicious, a bit fishy, and I think perhaps
You have
often
to
they do
take it
have.
playfully.
You know what's interesting is oftentimes you get this like midrash, uh, and they're like, oh, we derived this from this method, but then you have the same tradition in like Christian apocryphal texts, and that indicate.
That
uh,
in those cases, maybe you have independent traditions. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Coming back to sort of the composition, oh, right, the different ways of reading a text. Yeah, so in my opinion, I don't trust the author of Daniel's framing. He gets the Babylonian history. He gets so I do think the evidence is divided in terms of what does he think about Media Persia? Does he think it's Media then Persia or Media Persia? But regardless of which option you take, both of them are anachronistic because you
Yeah.
didn't have Babylon then Media then Persia. Like historically, that didn't happen. Media came first, and then you also didn't have Media and Persia together. I mean, I suppose traditional scholars would try and say that Cyrus uh, conquered both Media and he was the king of Persia, but I don't think that's what's
Well,
going on.
as far as I can figure, the way that schema originated, you first get the beginnings of it in Herodotus, and the way he has it is that you have first the Assyrians, then the Medes, then
Yeah.
the Persians, and this I think must have originated somewhere in Persia.
Hmm.
In an area where the Medes had actually ruled. It didn't originate in Judea, that's for sure. The Medes had nothing to do with Judea.
Yeah.
So I think that's what you had originally. And I
Yeah.
think Daniel is assuming that. But then he
Yeah.
probably also, I mean, by the time the later chapters were written, at least, they were familiar with the confusion of Media and Persia.
Yeah. So
And, you know,
I
but
think, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I think the redactor, like the collector, is sort of
yeah,
confused about this stuff. And the visions later on obviously want to connect it to Antiochus. Now, which Antiochus is not really in Daniel A, because Daniel A is earlier than Antiochus, and the Maccabean situation.
yeah.
Yeah, but I think that the author, or the if we just take Daniel 2 on its face value in sort of a pre-compositional situation, I think he is taking that Near Eastern Four Kingdom schema, but he's adjusting it.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah. So he doesn't have Assyria, he has Babylon.
that's right.
Why?
That's the
No.
obvious
Yeah.
adjustment.
Yeah.
And that's because Babylon was much more important to the Jews.
Yeah. Yeah. Even though
You know, the irony of it is, it would have made much better sense for the Jews to have gone Assyria, Babylon, Persia,
yeah.
and
Yeah,
leave the
exactly.
Medes out of it. But that's not what they did.
Yeah, so I think I mean uh we have no idea if Daniel, from a critical perspective, we don't know if Daniel existed historically. Now, we do have an Ezekiel tradition that Daniel was a figure.
Yeah,
It seems on its surface that he's an older figure,
much
but
older.
it doesn't need to be read that way. You could read it as a contemporary figure, but the vibe seems to be he's an earlier figure.
Like Noah.
So, yeah. Now, we
Yeah.
don't know where this four kingdom schema came from. If we come from it in a more of a, we add this, that perhaps he's working with prophetic tradition based on this idea that, as having some sort of belief in the Bible. So perhaps there was some figure or some Daniel or some prophetic figure where with some of these prophecies, and then the redactor sort of adjusting them and collecting them and giving his own spin and his own interpretation onto them. So I think if you look at the four kingdom schema, just historically you would get like if we so with Assyria, if you start with Assyria, Mede, Persia, and then Greece, that works. Obviously, historically, it doesn't, that doesn't work if you start with Babylon. Instead, you get like Babylon, and then Isaiah 45 has Cyrus next. So you'd have, so I think you just kick the Medes out of the picture. I don't know what they're doing. So you get like Babylon, then Persia,
Yeah.
then Greece, and then the next big, we know the next big kingdom for the Jews would be the Romans, and then you get the Islamic Empire, and now we have, like the British Empire came, nation states, and this sort of, so that's sort of how history's played out.
Mm.
Yeah, but I'm just a bit suspicious of this whole Medes thing, because they never ruled, and it's
Yeah.
very anachronistic. And I think if these stories are going back to a Persian time period, which some scholars suspect that they did originate in the Persian period, then whoever in the Persian period came up with this, he was not thinking about the Medes. I don't think so, because they never ruled. But anyway, that's my take on the kingdoms. I think in the pre-compositional context, the meanings would be different, especially if it goes back to a Persian source,
Yeah.
because there's no way a Jew living in Persia makes that historical mistake. So yeah. Okay, we're running out of time. I
Any
think I might
last
just, yeah.
thought or question?
Yeah. Last question. Let me see. I should pick a pick a good one. Yeah, this one might be a bit complicated, but so in Deuteronomy 18, we get this tradition of a prophet like Moses, right? Now, it's from the context, it seems very possible or plausible to interpret this as a reference to many prophetic, like basically a line of prophets starting not
Mhm.
with Joshua. I don't think it starts with Joshua, because Joshua is already a prophet, but maybe after Joshua. Um, but then obviously the author of Deuteronomy 34 disagrees with this. He says, no prophet in Israel rose up like Moses. So I think we get this sort of tension. Who is the prophet like Moses? Jeremiah 1 obviously says it's Jeremiah.
But
Joshua 1,
you
yeah,
know, the reason that the scriptural basis for the prophet like Moses is in the book of Deuteronomy,
yeah.
and it says, "A prophet like me, the Lord will raise up for you." Now, what that means is all these guys who are walking around like Ezekiel and Isaiah and Jeremiah, if they're not like me, don't pay any attention to them.
Hmm.
So, this was somebody who wanted to lift up the law of Moses over the prophets.
Yeah.
If the prophets claimed to have a hotline to heaven and that they had the ultimate word of what was the word of the Lord. And
It's interesting
Deuteronomy
because
wanted to say,
yeah,
no, they don't.
yeah, it's interesting because Moses is like, what makes Moses unique from? He's the lawgiver. He's the one the covenant comes to. And then you think about Isaiah, Jeremiah, none of them come with a law. None of them come with.
And
So I
none of
think
them that's not how they saw themselves.
yeah. I think
But this
Joel
was an
Baden.
attempt to
Yeah,
change prophecy.
yeah. Anyway, we'll leave it there because the 1 hour mark has been hit. I don't want to keep
Okay.
him beyond.
Yeah.
Huh?
Well, pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah. And perhaps we'll do this some other time.
Maybe some
And
other time.
yeah, thanks for
Leave
coming
it,
on, Dr. John.
leave it rest for a while. Yeah. Okay. Bye. Thank you.